So hi, everyone. I'm Meltem, and today Jim is sick and he has lost his voice, so I will be his voice in introducing Professor Roger Giner-Sorolla. He completed his undergraduate degree at Cornell University and was awarded his PhD in social psychology from NYU in 1996. And after a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Virginia and a two-year-long contracts, he joined the University of Kent in 2001. He was promoted to professor in 2013 and has been the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology since 2016. Roger is an advocate of transparency in scientific reporting and has written several articles and editorials in support of improved reporting guidelines and pre-registration. And his career has focused a lot on moral emotions, specifically self-condemning emotions of guilt and shame, and the other condemning ones of anger, contempt, and guilt and disgust. And he has done a lot of incredible work on morality, and today he's going to be telling us, he'll be unpacking the word moral in moral psychology. So with that, I'll ask everyone to clap on their own for Roger and write down in the chat where you're joining us from. Thank you.
Okay, should I take it away? Yeah, okay, well, thanks. Meltem, thank you, Jim, especially. Get better, Jim, really. And hello to everyone who's come to see me ramble on about the word moral in moral psychology. And this actually, the idea for this, from this talk came a few talks back, a couple of months ago, maybe when I did kind of notice, share my observation that people were kind of using the word moral in moral psychology in a kind of undefined, or to put it more charitably, axiomatic sense. Like, we all know what morality means, right? We know what it is to be moral. I'm going to challenge that assumption a little bit with reference to a number of literatures, and also offer some wild speculation about why moral psychology has been so popular as a field of study and as something to call the various social psychological phenomena you are studying, because popular indeed it has been. So let me just try to advance. Here we go. Yeah, morality, all the grammatical forms are trendy. And I've done the standard thing, which you should take with a grain of salt, because I understand Google Ngram changes the criteria for its lexicon. But so the comparisons are not exact, but you can see here the long and checkered history of the phrase social psychology as a proportion of phrases appearing in Google books. So sort of a selection of books in the English language that Google stores. And you can see social psychology had a real peak in the 30s. Declined in the 40s. I guess there was a war on, and then peaked again in 1960, had a decline. Recently, it's kind of become more talked about since about the year 2010, and I can't think about why that might be, people talking about social psychology, but the thing to notice is that climbing up here is moral psychology, steadily increasing in being talked about in Google books, but not quite overtaking social. However, personality psychology still, I don't know why people are not talking about personality psychology. Maybe there's no scandals in that field. But anyway, you might say, well, okay, Google books, Google Ngram, big deal. What about the academic literature? Fine. I took a big chunk of time this weekend and I went Google Scholar searching for articles, academic articles with moral or morality in the title, and had to come from a journal that had psychology or cognition in the title. And you can see here that on the basis of this search, the number of articles that involve morality in psychology and cognition has been growing nearly exponentially from the end of the 20th century. It's just been taking off like a rocket and shows no signs of slowing down. Kind of doubling in the first part of the 21st century, every 5 years or so. Okay, so yeah, morality is big news. You're all here, you're testimony to this, you're interested in moral psychology. And however, as I observed before, and I also wanted to do something a little more systematic to back up this observation, I did, believe it or not, I did qualitative research. I took a look at, I set myself an arbitrary time frame. The most recent 3 years, 2021 is almost over. The online issues are all completed now in the journals, and I wanted to look just at the toppermost of the poppermost, the JPSB, the #1 journal in social psychology, and to look at all 20 articles I found that satisfied this search criterion of having moral or morality in the title. And what I found is that all of them, except for 3, according to my judgment, now you may criticize my judgment, but I was trying to be open-minded here, but a lot of them left morality undefined or axiomatic. Now, I'm going to emphasize right away, it is not incumbent on you. You don't have the obligation to define all your terms right away in a paper. You can leave some of them just to be understood by people. You don't have to start out talking about geometry by saying a triangle, as you know, is a figure in a plane with 3 sides. That you just assume that the audience knows that. But I think morality is a special case because I'm not sure people agree on what morality is. In fact, I know for a fact that people don't agree on what morality is. So the definition of morality in that case, unlike that of a triangle, gets a little more important. So I'm going to give, again, I don't want to be singling out people, but I did find some choice examples. And like I said, no blame on this. This is just a view of how we take these as axiomatic, right? So here's a paper by Andrew Monroe and Bertrand Mallet, basically starting out about morality. Morality is important. You can hardly read a newspaper without encountering issues of blame, praise, moral responsibility, or moral character. So we're not really defining morality so much as giving examples of topics, many of which contain the word morality itself. And then go the whole research literature, a lot of reviews showing morality is important. But what is morality? There's some examples, but not really a definition. Here's another example from Alexander Fleischman and colleagues, and very recently, moral exemplars encourage and inspire people to be virtuous and moral. Okay, so moral examples, what are they? Virtue and morality. What is virtue? It's the state of being moral. And then you have a lot of examples of moral exemplars. And here, people find inspiration in less extreme moral comparisons. For example, they admire colleagues who do their work in an exemplary manner, or family members who've lived virtuous lives. Once again, this idea of virtue. But here again, we're seeing that maybe the definition of morality is a little loose, because I wouldn't think that people who do their work in an exemplary manner, unless it is morally exemplary, unless it is especially kind or generous, for example, would be examples of a moral positive. They might just be very efficient at their work. So we see here, although it's generally not a huge problem, there are a few loose ends left if you leave morality undefined. So let's turn to the people who did feel a need to define morality from my look at recent JPSPs. Here's one that just comes right out and says it. Hennigan-Hutter from 2020, research on moral judgment, and then the definition in between M dashes, humans' judgments on which behaviors or attitudes they consider right or wrong. And this is a very common kind of dictionary definition using these terms right or wrong, more about which later. And this is all about the deontological utilitarian, the good old trolley scenario. And they do cite Philippa Foot, which I really appreciate. And then here is Beza Tepe and colleague talking about really some of the really hard issues about defining morality and some of the points on which psychologists and also philosophers disagree on the definition of morality. So it's a controversy. Some people argue that the answer is universal and it's based on harm, and others maintain that morality can't be reduced to harm, and it's also culturally variant. That's a very nice way to sum up this particular controversy. So, however, again, this is a definition that is completely different from this dictionary definition up here on right or wrong. It's talking about the content of morality rather than this kind of synonymous definition of morality. And then finally, this third one, I gave them the benefit of the doubt because they do say moral characteristics such as generosity and altruism. And it might be a definition, it might be just a couple of examples, but they do define the morality, generosity, and altruism being pro-social. Okay, and that's, I'll take that as a definition, but it's yet a third kind of definition of morality. And so what I did is I took a look at the other 17 JPSB articles, and I took a very open-minded approach. Even though they might not have an explicit definition, let's look at some of the concepts they link to morality. Let's look at some of the measures they use, and let's look at the implicit operationalization of morality in these other articles. And so I counted them up. These numbers add up to more than 17 because some drew on more than one view of morality. But I found that 4 of them, plus the Henning-Hutter I already showed you, were about life or death, sacrificial dilemmas, consequentialism, deontological morality, a very well studied topic these days. Okay, so they were using the trolley, not literally always, but you all get this. Then we had 5 of them were anchoring their morality on concepts from the moral foundations, the well-known Graham and Haidt concepts such as harm, purity, using one or more of these concepts of the content of moral concerns. 4 of them defined morality in anchoring them on standards such as sacred values or people's ideals and oughts, which is another view of morality in psychology. 3 of them defined morality, as we've seen before, in terms of self-enhancement versus pro-sociality. Morality is being kind and generous and nice to other people. And then we had a couple of others. 2 of them defined morality as blame. And then 1 of them was looking at virtue ethics, character, virtue, and vice judgment. This was one about hypocrisy and how people who appear virtuous but actually commit vices are seen as hypocrites. Okay, so lots of different views of morality here. Is there anything really conceptually that binds these together, or is this just a grab bag of things that happen to fall under a single term? Before I answer this question, I also have to bring up a cultural and linguistic objection that has been raised to this very term of morality. And this is one of my favorite people in linguistics, Anna Wierzbicka, who works at the Australian National University, and she is always doing great work calling out psychology, philosophy, whoever, for relying on the English language in defining such things as emotions. And here in a couple of articles, she's turned her eye onto this concept of morality. And she wrote an article, Moral Sense, in 2007, where she argues that this moral sense refers to a very recently developed, only a few hundred years old, English language concept that basically underpins our understanding of the word moral and is based on the idea that people have a sense of morality, i.e. that it's intuitive and universal, as natural as seeing or hearing things. And elsewhere, she makes the point that morality, as we've already seen, is often defined in terms of right and wrong. But these things, unlike good and bad, are not semantic universals. One of the neat things about Wierzbicka's writings is she's created this language of semantic universals, which she says are universally accepted constructs that exist in every language. And then she points out things that don't exist in every language in the same way. And for her, the terms right and wrong in the moral sense are one of these English-specific sets of terms. So she has another article from 2002 looking at this concept of right and wrong, which underpins our definition of morality. And she argues right then and there that right and wrong are not universal human concepts, but they are English words, and she claims without equivalence in other European languages, let alone in languages of more remote origin, right? So her argument, I won't completely recap the argument, but even in English, the origin of right and wrong, the exact meaning of right and wrong, has evolved over time. And if you go back to Shakespeare, Shakespeare mostly uses right in the sense of true, or straight, and uses wrong mainly as in reference to harms, like why did you wrong me, like that. Okay, but over the next couple of centuries in the English language, what happens are two things. You have Puritanism, which creates an increased moralization of life and thought. And you also have the Enlightenment and people wanting to find a universal basis for human morality, especially among British and Scottish philosophers. So as English develops, the word right takes on a unique meaning. And it ends up having three different meanings that kind of blend together. So right, according to Wierzbicka, first of all means factually correct, that is right, that is correct. But it also means morally good, but it takes on this additional baggage from factual correctness. So it's this idea of morally good almost in an objective sense, whereas other languages can say something is morally good, but without having this additional baggage. And then finally, people use right in conversation to agree or validate. Right, that's right, yeah. In other languages, you're more likely to say good, yes, or the equivalent. So if you, regardless of whether or not you believe this, and you can probably point to other languages, so I'd be interested in people's perspectives in the discussion. But it seems to me that we certainly are guilty of relying on the English language to carry psychology forward. It's almost exclusively published in English. Other languages are not widely read or spoken. English has become a lingua franca, and we open ourselves up to this monoculture and the possibility that our understanding of morality might not extend cross-culturally. Okay. And I just also want to say that the etymology of moral in English, coming from other languages, also has a long history, and going even beyond the period that Wierzbicka talks about. So the origin of moral etymologically is from Latin, mos, and this word, even in Latin, also changed over time. It started out as being a disposition, then it got a plural that some of you might know, mores, all right, the mores of a society. Even this meant customs, things that are important, but didn't have the full sense of morality. Here we have Marcus Tullius Cicero, who is famous for exclaiming, o tempora, o mores, which means, oh, what times, what morals, or I've heard it translated, what times, what customs. It's something you exclaim when you see the younger generation is doing things that you don't approve of. And here I found this inscribed on a baby bib that's for sale on Cafe Press. I can imagine a 6-month-old baby exclaiming this and talking about how newborns, they don't really know how good they have it. They're, why do they always cry? I don't get it. But anyway, this mores, Cicero is here because he coined moralis as an adjective. And then he starts this concept of a person who hews to the mores, to the customs, to the things that are important. And the thing I want to point out here is that I think morality in the English language now, especially as used by psychologists, has excluded the merely conventional. It's not just about whether you wear your toga over the correct shoulder, but it's more about other things that are not just about fashion or saying bless you after someone sneezes or something like that. And there was even a kind of a sidetrack of the word moral that I found out about recently, where in the 19th century in the English language, the moral was taken to mean not the kind of things we associate with morality, but courage, in the sense of a soldier being able to stand and fight instead of running away when under danger. And we still see vestiges of this in some of the terms that we use. So if you've heard of moral support, you might know this phrase. You might look back and unpack it and think, why is it moral support? It just means giving someone courage. It means helping them to stand up for something. It doesn't mean aligning them with moral precepts as we understand them, or a moral victory. Again, what does that mean exactly? And the notion here is about character, and it's about a facet of character called courage, which today is not often spoken of as a precisely moral attribute. You can have courage, but you can have courage to do terrible things as well as good things. And this is also where our word morale comes from. You speak of the morale of soldiers or the morale of people in an organization, okay, which means, again, their courage. And this came up actually because on Twitter, I know we're all here to get away from Twitter, especially this week, but Mark Brandt brought up this question: do birds have moral superiority? And this is actually, you know, the kind of thing that got published in the journal Nature about 100 years ago, where two gentlemen scholars are having this discussion. Oh yes, I saw two birds, and the smaller bird fought off the two larger birds as it was they were fighting for a lump of bread. And this is an example of moral superiority. I'm like, oh yes, I also saw birds showing moral superiority. And what does that mean exactly? Well, it can only be understood in the sense of morality as courage. Also made me think of this phrase again on a wearable item of clothing from Cafe Press or similar. You have Napoleon's famous proverb about warfare, that the moral is to the physical in war as 3 to 1. And here he's not talking about you should be good and kind to people in war and give out chocolate bars to the people that you invade. No, he was talking about the morale with an E on the end, the morale of an army. An army that is cohesive with the will to fight can overwhelm an army 3 times its size without those attributes. Okay, so yeah, morality has had different meanings over time. And I think what it's left with today is a word that outstrips its synonyms. What do I mean by this? I mean that even if you take dictionary definitions of morality, you cannot exactly reconstruct morality from the synonyms that it's attributed. So is morality just the process of judgments of human acts, thoughts, and dispositions to be right or wrong? We've seen this in many dictionary definitions. We've seen it in one of our JPSB articles, morality, the sense of right and wrong, in Wierzbicka's work. And even if we take Wierzbicka at her word and say, okay, let's not use these terms right and wrong, let's just use the judgment of human acts and thoughts and dispositions to be good or bad. But all these examples work for right and wrong, the ones I'm about to give for good and bad. Okay, so first of all, you can have a sense of good and bad pragmatically. It helps or hurts the individual. It is a sign of the individual's prowess, right? This person is a good dancer. This person is good at mathematics, at statistics. Okay, so that's a pragmatic sense of good or bad. We don't put a lot of moral weight on being a good dancer in current usage, but we admire them and they're effective, and we see them as valuable. You can also have the sense of good and bad in the old sense of mores, the Roman sense of mores. This person follows the conventions. They wear their hat in the correct manner. They follow the customs. But here again, this is not quite enough to get us to the current psychological sense of morality, because many definitions of morality exclude from the moral sphere things that are merely conventional. For example, Turiel's definitions. So we now are left here with the third sense of things that are good, even if they're not pragmatic, if they don't immediately help the individual, and even if it's not customary. So you have something that I think we acknowledge morality to be, the thing that is good, even if it hurts you, you do the right thing. And even if it's not customary, you do the right thing. And that is the real moral rightness that is behind our implicit definitions. So this creates a difficulty for the dictionary definitions, because the sense of morality is often defined by excluding these first two senses of pragmatic and conventional benefit, and yet synonyms like good, right, or correct don't really exclude them. So when you're looking for a synonym for morality, it's not going to be just right or wrong, because those can have different senses. In addition, there is this debate in philosophy and psychology that Tepe's article alluded to and presented a third alternative to. But this is the debate between, is morality something universalistic or pluralistic? And I'll just describe this because I think this is an additional complication, and it means perhaps that we should be a little more careful in psychology of how we define morality, because there's a debate over what it is. What is the nature of moral principles? So moral monism, as exemplified by people who've supported this, such as John Jost or Kurt Gray, means that only concerns about harms and benefits are normatively moral. Or to put it another way, morality in Kurt Gray's view is based fundamentally upon harm, and you cannot have morality without some sort of a sense of harm. And what these explanations have also lead to is the idea that this is a universal morality. It is both objectively a universal morality in the sense that all cultures who espouse a morality build this morality about harms and benefits to other people, how harm is to be regulated and how resources are to be shared out, what is fair, what is just. And also they seem subjectively universal in that people tend to espouse these things as rules that apply to everyone. Okay, so they're rules that that everyone should follow. They're not just for us, for our group, for our class of people, but they're universal ethics. Whereas pluralism has been espoused by people like Richard Schrader, Jonathan Haidt, Tage Rai, and Alan Fiske, the idea that concerns such as purity, duty, loyalty, or social morality based in social relationships, these are also descriptively moral in the sense that people believe them to be moral, believe it to be moral to avoid polluting yourself by eating foods that are forbidden to your religion or to your caste in India, even though cultures are critical in defining the content of these things. So what is your duty as a member of a society, as a man, a woman, as a parent, as a child? These are not universal morality. They are moralities based on cultural criteria and on people's social roles. And they also differ both in the importance and their content between cultures. And so the comeback of monistic philosophies and psychologies, I think, to this pluralism and demonstrations of pluralism is one of two things. Either you say, well, these other concerns are not really moral. They're conventions. They can be moralized, but they're not true morality. You can treat them as being morally important, but they don't count truly as morality. Another approach, as shown in Kurt Gray's more recent evolutions of his theory, is actually these concerns about purity, duty, and loyalty are actually about harm. They're about collective harm and avoiding collective harm. So really, it all comes back to harm, even though formally some of these are expressed not in terms of harm to individuals, but harms to the social order. So I don't really have time to get into this whole debate as much as I would like to, but I'm just presenting this to show you that even within psychology, when we do bother to define morality, we have two very different views of what morality encompasses in psychology. So now I'm just going to skip over to my definition of the word morality. You can take it or leave it. You can debate it in the comments or in discussion after this. I wrote this down 10 years ago. It's in a book that I published called Judging Passions. It's mostly about moral emotions, but I thought I needed to start this book with definitions of morality, emotions, and groups, given that the book was about moral emotions and groups. So my definition of morality, after thinking it through, reading a little bit of the philosophy literature, is this: moral concerns are those which so the first part of the definition is they represent the interests of a higher level of social organization at a lower level. And I do acknowledge that perhaps your future self, the way you treat your future self, can also be a moral issue. So things like saving money or not abusing your body with substances and things like that can be moralized easily because they represent a higher level of personal organization as well as social organization. Of course, a lot of these things also have implications for society. Not becoming a drug addict means that you are not a burden on society, and so on. So let me give you an example I always use when I'm teaching about this, right? So let's imagine somebody and their brother is being called up for the army. There's conscription, they have to go off to a war that your country is fighting. And you say, I don't want my brother to be conscripted. I'm a doctor, I'm going to write my brother a false prescription. There's a chance I could be found out and thrown in prison, but I'm taking an individual personal risk in order to benefit my family and a person I care about very much. And looked at from this lens, you are doing something moral by taking on the interests of the higher level of organization, your family, even though you individually, personally might be harmed by it. Okay, so your moral sense, if you will, is to help your brother, and that is moral because it represents the higher level of organization, the family versus your own self. On the other hand, somebody could argue that actually what you're doing is not moral, and the moral thing is to let your brother serve the army because the nation is a higher level of social organization than your family. And this nation has agreed to fight in this war, and so it's incumbent on every family to give up its able-bodied men to fight in the war, even though they might get killed and certainly are going to be inconvenienced by having to go off to war. So from the point of view, if you reframe it as the nation is the higher level of social organization and the family is the smaller, then the moral thing to do is to let your brother go and fight in the war. But then we can take a higher level yet of social organization. You can say, actually, your war is immoral. I take the worldview, and the worldview is that your country is carrying out an immoral war. They're invading people, bombing people, doing evil things here. It's not, I'm American myself, so I feel entitled to use the US flag, and no, it's not giving the world a hug here in this point of view. Right? So it's this idea that your nation is not the ultimate endpoint of morality, but rather the world is. And from that point of view, you are justified in keeping your brother away from the war because you are serving yet a higher mode of social organization. But then we need the second part of the definition. So the moral concerns are those that normatively take precedence over other concerns, even including those that may serve higher levels of social organization, like customs. Customs, if everyone wears the same clothing, you can tell they're part of the group, and your clothes shopping becomes very easy if everyone is wearing the same thing. And I think we need the part B of the definition to help to distinguish true moral principles from mere conventions. In other words, to focus in on those things that are truly seen as sacred values. But what this means by defining this in terms of precedence, it means that you can have actually concerns that are more or less moral, and then things that are in the middle that are less moral than one thing, but more moral than the other thing. So based on admittedly my imperfect understanding of Jewish practice, and please, I'm not Jewish myself, but please let me know if I've made a faux pas here. But in my understanding, the Jewish religion has a set of commandments or laws or moral norms that are called the Noahide laws that are said to apply to all people, both Jewish and Gentile, right? And these are fairly basic things. And you might say most of these are about this kind of basic harm morality. Don't murder, don't steal, don't harm animals, uphold justice. There are a few things about idolatry and God that you might say are more about purity, but they're also about kind of universal religion, right? Anyone who is part of a monotheist religion should be able to follow these precepts. Then you have other things that are other rules and laws, religious laws in the Jewish religion, such as kosher, keeping kosher, that are really only expected for people who are Jewish to keep. And it is immoral if you're Jewish to break these laws, but it's seen as less of an offense. And you can get a dispensation, for example, if you're in a very desperate situation and the only thing to eat is pork. By my understanding, if you're Jewish, you're allowed to do that in order to keep yourself alive and respect the life that God has given you. And then finally, there are things that are merely conventional in the Jewish religion, such as, I found this example of a group of Hasidic women who are a branch of Orthodox Judaism, who founded an alternative rock group. And you don't really expect that of the Hasidic community, but at the same time, it's unconventional, yet it's not seen as necessarily immoral. So, so I think the importance of morality is an important part of the definition of morality. And so as I tend to land on the pluralism side of things, I think that morality this definition is agnostic about the content of morality, except for one rule that you might say, well, my most pressing rule, my most important rule is something that is selfishness, right? My most important rule is that the individual should be out for themselves and act as a law unto themselves. And I believe this should be a universal morality that everyone should practice. I tackle these in the book, and I call these anti-moralities. We have practitioners of these fairly unfairly, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, the founder of objectivism as a philosophy, and then this fellow in the middle is Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satanism. And yes, Satanism also has this highly individual morality that draws on both of these other thinkers. Well, I think mostly because of part A of the definition, that you need to observe a higher form of social organization, these kinds of anti-moralities don't really fit the definition. And that it's contained even in the way that these speakers often rail against the very concept of morality itself. And they say that this morality as practiced is not a fit guide for human behavior. But again, I can discuss that as well. So why is moral psychology so popular, even though this definition is so slippery and people disagree on it, and it tends to be very elusive? Okay, I'm going to get a little provocative here, if I haven't been already, and I'm going to offer one kind of cynical view of this, that when you say that you study moral psychology, or you are a moral researcher or a morality researcher, you take advantage of the halo of the word morality. That's right. I'm using associative psychology, implicit psychology, rhetoric, if you will. In other words, moral psychologist, like criminal lawyer, is a phrase with ambiguous construction. Maybe those of you who've seen Breaking Bad will recall the character Saul Goodman, who he's an attorney who operates out of a strip mall, and he advertises his services in the phrase, you don't want a criminal lawyer, you want a criminal lawyer. That is, you don't want a lawyer who handles criminal cases, you want a lawyer who is himself criminal. And so likewise, moral psychologist, is that a psychologist who studies morality, or is that a psychologist who is actually moral? And you may disagree with this. You might say, you're stretching. This is taking things too far to explain the rise of moral psychology. But formally, if you're going to believe the psychology literature, if you're going to believe that some things can create positive affect by association, if you're going to believe in evaluative conditioning, you have to admit that calling something moral, whatever, moral dumbfounding, moral licensing, moral mandates, creates positive affect just by association. And if you still don't believe me, if you study wrong as well as right behavior, and I know a lot of us do, we study both praise and blame, we study good and bad character, but even though the bad stuff is more interesting, that's why I only study negative moral emotions like anger, disgust, shame, and guilt, contempt, and so on, but I would never think of calling myself an immoral psychologist instead of a moral psychologist. I would say, no, that would mean that I would call myself immoral. So why is calling yourself a moral psychologist also not questionable for involving the concept moral? I could call myself a scholar of depravity. There's all sorts of things that I could call myself negatively, but we never seem to do that. And I think it's because there's a bias towards the positive in this one instance where we characterize and name ourselves. And it is documented that stigma from negatively labeled research topics can and does occur. I wasn't able to find any empirical studies of this, but there's got to be a meta-science study in the wings somewhere out there showing that people who study things like drug abuse, pedophilia, and so on have a stigma coming from what they actually study. Here's an article I found, and this was really just kind of amazing and really sad and disturbing at the same time, because it comes from 1981. And here are, basically, these are two straight sociologists who wrote an article about how their fieldwork among deviants, and as you read the article, you'll see by deviants, they meant actually, gay and lesbian populations, were putting them at risk for the contagion of stigma. In other words, they were saying not only do they get the stigma from studying these people, but people might actually assume that we are that way ourselves. And there was a little undercurrent of straight panic here in this article. Like it's a great problem. How do we convince people that we're not gay, even though we go to gay bars in order to do field work among gay men? And they actually asked some of the folks in the gay bar, how do you pass as a straight person? And funnily enough, some of those men knew about how to pass as a straight person. They gave some tips, which, if you read them today, are kind of cringeworthy, like ask women out less discreetly than you've been doing, and get a woman to come by and drop off something for you so people think you're dating her. This is really, mind-blowing and also very sad, because of just, if there was this level of concern about just secondhand homophobia towards straight guys who study this stuff, imagine how much worse it is if you're actually one of these populations trying to study your own populations. So, but if you can have this stigma, and this is just amazing, another amazing thing from this article, when they submitted this paper to peer review, and they included this in a revision, a reviewer said, I tend to agree with the folk belief that when there's smoke, there's probably fire of one kind or another. When I read that issue of journal name devoted to sex studies, which sounded like an X-rated pornographic magazine, I wondered about the editor and thought she must be somewhat, what shall I say, unusual, odd, creepy. All right, so, and I think we can all acknowledge that this is a danger, and I've certainly heard anecdotes from people who study sexuality that they often get dismissed or stigmatized because of the research that they do. So if stigma stemming from negatively labeled research can occur, why not halo from socially praised labels? One more thing to convince you that we're all in moral psychology because we want to really look like great and moral people. Why do we think it's so ironic when people who research morality are associated with fraud? And I don't even need to mention that case this year, because we had, way back in the day, of course, Mark Hauser on the left, who researched morality and then was accused of having fabricated lots of data at Harvard University. And everyone's like, ha ha, moral researcher, how ironic. And then Diederik Stapel, even though his, we all know this guy, but even though his main topic of research was not morality, he did a couple of studies on morality. Then everyone zoomed in on those studies. Isn't that ironic that these studies about morality had completely fabricated and fraudulent data? So if we think it's ironic, maybe that's evidence that we have this expectation that people who research morality are better than the rest. However, not to be so cynical, I also think, and I'm just going to wrap it up here pretty soon, that morality is appealing to study precisely because of some of the issues I've brought up. It's this ambiguity that makes it interesting to study. Okay, morality is something that people should agree upon in theory, because morality holds a culture together, and it's often associated with something that people should universally acknowledge. And yet, as we've seen, so this graphic of agreement, it binds people in a nice little circle. And yet, especially when you get down to specific cases, it sparks intense disagreement. And you don't even need to talk about different moral foundations or different bases of morality. Even in purely harm morality, you have these questions of, is it right or wrong to harm this person in order to give a benefit to this other person, the kind of sacrificial or welfare trade-off dilemmas that we all know. And there's intense disagreement in case law of moral principles and moral rules. Okay, so because of this, disagreement, even though it should be universal, it has universal appeal, yet is guaranteed to embrace a lot of the controversies in contemporary society. On even looking at the pandemic, something very important, and morality of how we deal with the pandemic is a huge issue of trade-offs of economy versus human life, of one human life versus the other, who should get the vaccine, all of these things. And I think this is not surprising. By my own definition, morality is about the most normatively important principles in society. So of course, studying it is going to give a lot of inherent weight to whatever it is you're studying. And I'll close with this question: have I just been ranting and raving and saying, "Oh tempora, oh mores," like some old Roman senator? No, because I think this word matters in a couple of specific instances in psychology. Okay, and yeah, I think we've escaped really problematizing this, because most fields of moral psychology just start from a specific phenomenon. They start from life and death, sacrificial dilemmas. They start from moral virtue, perceptions of moral character. They start from benevolence versus selfishness as a conflict. So they ground themselves in a specific phenomenon. They label it moral. They don't really need to tackle the question, what makes this and this other thing and that other thing over there all moral together? But if, for example, and I'm really curious about this, because I saw as I was rereading that article from Beza Tepe's group, that they were actually using the word moral and saying, would this be moral? Would this be more or less moral? And they were doing it not only in English, but also in Turkish. So the translatability of the word morality into other languages and the nuances and what that means is actually vitally important if we're going to say that there are cross-cultural differences or similarities in morality. And also, we did some research, Sophie Russell, Jared Piazza, and I did some research a while ago, where we showed that measures that use the term moral disgust behave very differently from measures that just use the term disgust. That when you slap the word moral onto measures, then that carries a lot of semantic baggage, and people are more likely to apply moral disgust to all kinds of things just because you've included the word moral in there. And so we really need to think about what are our lay views of morality that people are depending on. Okay, and with that, I will thank you, because my talk is done, almost on time. And yeah, I'd be very interested to hear people's questions.
All right, so the first off, the question with the most votes is from Fan Yang. I think your definition is very interesting, but I still don't totally understand what higher levels means here. Is it similar to more important, and higher from whose perspective?
Yeah, by higher, I just mean if you think of hierarchically nested levels of social organization, then I just simply mean larger ones that include smaller ones. Okay, so the example I gave here is individuals within families. Maybe you have something intermediate like family within village, village within region, region within nation, nation within world, humans of the world within all the species of the world, planets of the universe. That's a little far-fetched, but that's basically what I mean. So by higher, it's just like the traditional organizational chart where you have or like how military units are organized, where you have platoons, companies, battalions, regiments, etc., all nested within each other. That's only what I mean. I don't mean, and actually it's interesting because there are some views of morality which I think are, despite my own liberal views, I think it's legitimate to say that morality stops with my country. And these are people who are nationalist and don't trust supranational organizations. and we might decry them as being bigoted, but that is, if you talk about the basis of conservatism, that is one of the bases, is that, you know, the nation state is kind of the end point of morality. We shouldn't acknowledge these supranational organizations.
Thank you. So the next question is from Diane Sunar. How do you classify Curry et al.'s morality as cooperation?
Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I would, yeah, actually I meant to include it in this talk. I'm sorry. I would see it as being in the same. Yeah, I would see it as potentially pluralistic, but also in a way kind of universalistic in the sense that all of these social modes of cooperation potentially can occur in a society, but to the extent that different societies emphasize different modes of cooperation, it can lead to pluralism. But yeah, that is certainly another definition of morality, and I see this also as related to Ryan Fisk's Ryan Fisk's theory, the idea of different relational models underpinning morality. Both of these are, one is a little more about cooperation explicitly, but yeah, these I think are I'll go out on a limb and say they're pluralistic. I'm not sure if they would agree with me, but
all right, the next question is from Mark Herman. One goal we might have for psychological taxonomy is to carve the mind at its intrinsic joints. For instance, by using categories that correspond with the operations of the mind causal system. To what extent should the definition of morality in psychology be open to being bent to fit such categories, such as how externalist should our scientific semantics be?
Okay, to carve the mind at its joints, to use categories that correspond with the operations of the mind. Yeah, that's a tricky one, because what are those operations of the mind? I think if you're talking about the building blocks of morality, we might think of things like a system for tracking moral character. Are people morally good and morally bad? A system for assigning blame. A system for looking at harm, how much harm has been caused. Is this proportional? Can we weigh the harm against the benefit of any such thing? So I think those operations are part of the way in which we evaluate things as moral and non-moral, but I'm not sure that I think those can accompany the definition, but you need some sort of boundary around what you consider to be the moral realm. And you might find that there are some mechanisms that are similar between the moral and the non-moral realm. Causality and blame are quite similar. Blame follows slightly different rules because it's biased towards certain outcomes, as opposed to just merely disinterestedly finding causality, but they do draw on a lot of the same mental processes. So yeah, I'm not sure that morality has 100% a ring-fenced set of mental contents and processes that it uses, but it's more about a realm of things that are judged that are considered moral, if that kind of makes sense.
The next question is from Anna Leal. This is more of a question/comment. Perhaps part of the conceptual issues related to morality may have to do with how we measure or operationalize morality. For example, some operationalizations imply a notion of right and wrong, or assume that something reflects moral concerns, such as moral judgments, but it's not measured the extent to which something is vested with moral meaning, such as moral attitudes or convictions.
Yeah, I think the way at the start I looked at recent research and observed that many of these lines of research work on a specific paradigm. They right. So if you're studying moral convictions, for example, and these often refer to sacred values and the basis of attitudes and values, which is a very long-standing topic in attitudes. So you might say things are more or less moral. They might have more or less this moral standing, whereas other fields, like perhaps the sacrificial dilemma field, just assumes that whichever way you decide, this is going to have moral meaning because it's about people's lives and deaths and making decisions between them. So it's just implicitly morality, and that's absolutely right. And I think we are at this stage where a lot of our definitions of morality, and the concern is morality a variable or more of a background? Depends on what kind of research we do and what we do it with.
All right, the next question is from Stella Gadamon. I wonder how your definition would be able to differentiate morality and cooperation. It does seem like for behavior to be moral, the notion that the principles are mutually agreed upon and not only greater than ourselves, such as non-selfish, is important.
Well, I think this is why the Curry's model of morality seems so persuasive, because a lot of our morality is based on cooperation, especially if you look at more large-scale things of cooperation, like cooperation in norms of sexual behavior, cooperation in norms of how we treat our body, what kind of things that we eat. So it does seem like for behavior to be moral, the notion that the principles are mutually agreed upon and not only greater than ourselves is important. Mutually agreed upon, but there are definitions of morality that emphasize that it should be authority independent. Again, going back to Turiel's developmental studies of the development of morality, that and also a lot of philosophical discourse about morality the same way, that if you believe something is moral, you believe it is right to do, even if everybody else conventionally says it's not the right thing to do. And this is how people maintain moral stances of dissent and disagreement and objection. This is how you explain conscientious objectors and vegans, and they may have a community within themselves, but it is possible to think of somebody who truly believes they are the only moral person because only they have the true well-being of humanity at hand, and everyone else who follows conventions is not working towards the true well-being of humanity. So I think for that reason, I'm trying to stick with this definition of morality as being authority or even consensus independent for that reason, and also to be a psychological view of morality, what you think it is rather than what is actually objectively the case. I think that's very important, especially in the monism pluralism debate, because you may disagree with a lot of things that are passed off as morality. You may say, this loyalty is only authoritarianism, and this, this obedience is only bigotry, this purity is only prejudice. And you might express all of those opinions, but you then have to say, well, in the mind of the person who believes that certain sexual expressions are immoral, in their mind, that is morality. Even if you don't agree objectively, that's morality. So I think you have to stay as a psychologist within the subjective realm of morality, and what do people consider to be moral.
I think we're almost at time, but we could have one more question from Igor Grossman. The issue of lack of specificity is common to many areas. Definition of rationality, good judgment suffer from similar issues, but JDM research also provides a counterpoint. Most JDM researchers would not say that they study good judgment. Even Phil Tetlock would probably not.
Yeah, I mean, there may be something contagious about moral questions, and especially You know, I'm thinking of the Jonathan Haidt type moral questions where just to talk about some of the scenarios you use in your research is a little bit sketchy, and you kind of joke about it, joke about that chicken, you know, but yeah, the JDM is, I think, is a little drier. And I think they're trying to get interest value over this kind of transfer of affect. So yeah, I know, again, it's just a speculation. But yeah, why does studying bad judgments, I don't know, maybe bad pragmatic choices are not contagious to the person who studies them the way that bad moral choices are. Might be a study in there for someone to look at. Seems plausible, but again, it's purest speculation.
Well, there are a lot more questions. I've copied some of them so I can send it to you separately.
All right, is there a way? Is there a way for me to answer them at my own leisure and get them back to all of you?
Yeah. So I just wanted to stop for your sake, but if you want to continue answering them,
yeah, or even asynchronously, you know.
Definitely. I can save the chat and the Q&A questions and send it to you if you'd like that.
Yeah, I think that's best. But I can actually handle these two. I can handle these two.
Okay.
The first one from Tomasz. Yeah, I agree. So would you agree with Haidt that morality's function is to limit individual egoistic motives? I would agree, and I add on to that, as you say, that because I've studied collective moral emotions, that you need to have that higher level. So so this whole idea of an international community, you feel collective guilt for what your nation has done. That makes no sense as an individual. It only makes sense if you see the nation as nested within the world, the needs of the world as a whole, to have peace and justice and so on. So yeah, it is the higher level of social organization is about limiting the needs of certain individuals so that collective needs or egalitarian goals can be met. And then Hannah's question about Germany. German, it's funny because, you know, Wierzbicka is always saying, look, things are so different in German and Polish and Russian, all these languages that she knows. So yeah, this use of right and wrong is similar in Germany. Okay, point taken. I don't speak very good German, so I'll take your word for it. But again, we might also even take this as a more general warning to look in terms of other languages that are beyond the Indo-European family, beyond, you know, the Northern or Latin families, and really take a look. It might be a universal concept, but I would bet it also has some nuances that you don't get in English.
Well, thank you so much for sticking around a few extra minutes to answer all the questions. It was a wonderful talk, and I'm sure it will continue sparking up more further conversations about what morality is, probably on Twitter and beyond. So
please
thank you so much for sharing this
discourse. All right, thank you so much, Meltem and Jim. Get better, Jim.
Thank you so much, Roger. Thanks,
oh my
Meltem.
God, no, don't.
And thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Oh, Lord. Bye now.